The point of no return for Loki, where he crossed a fine and painfully irreversible line, can be marked by his active and deliberate participation in the events that led to the near-complete destruction of Jotunheim and, consequently, Thor's agonizing banishment to Earth. Driven by intense jealousy of his brother and a burning thirst to prove his worth and superiority to Odin, Loki manipulated his companions, orchestrated complex intrigues behind the scenes of Asgardian power, and instigated a direct confrontation with the Frost Giants that had disastrous and far-reaching consequences for all realms. This act was not merely an elaborate trick or harmless ploy for attention. It was a calculated transgression, an act of profound betrayal that jeopardized innocent lives, the fragile peace between realms, and the very stability of Asgard. From that moment on, his actions began to carry a much heavier weight, an undeniable destructive character, and the consequences of his choices became more severe and difficult to reverse, solidifying his path into darkness and opposition. His worldview became even darker, more cynical and nihilistic, as if a distorted and corrupted lens had been permanently attached to his perception. He came to believe that order, justice, and loyalty were mere illusions, convenient disguises for true power and manipulation, and that force, manipulation, and control were the only tools that truly mattered in the cosmos for survival and prosperity. His morality became fluid and malleable, conveniently adapting to his needs and ambitions of the moment, without any attachment to fixed ethical principles. He rationalized his cruelest manipulations, his lies, and his acts of aggression as necessary actions to achieve his goals, justifying his vile means through ends that, in his distorted mind, were valid, necessary, and even noble, a way to bring order to what he saw as chaos. We can bring the viewer into a deep and uncomfortable moral dilemma. What if Loki was right in his view that the world is a ruthless and selfish place where only the most cunning and implacable survive and thrive, and that morality is merely a convention for the weak? This perspective, though dark and disheartening, raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of morality, the relativity of ethics, and the inherent cruelty in the struggle for power. The transgression in Jotunheim and the subsequent events that unfolded revealed the depth of his accumulated grievance, the extent of his resentment, and his terrifying willingness to inflict large-scale harm and suffering to gain the recognition and attention he felt he was denied and so desperately craved. His quest for acceptance, which began as an understandable and perhaps even innocent yearning, had completely warped into a voracious and insatiable pursuit of power, control, and a way to impose his will on others, forcing them to acknowledge his existence. The disturbing question that arises and echoes throughout his journey is, how far is a wounded person with a deep and persistent sense of inadequacy and an unwavering desire to prove their worth, capable of going to finally find their place in the world, even if that place is on a tyrant's throne, built upon the ruins of trust and peace? This is the central question that haunts us when contemplating the journey of the God of Mischief. Loki's mind, though focused on intricate schemes and complex plans that defied common logic, operated with a sophisticated, perceptive, and at times unsettlingly coherent internal logic within its own distorted framework. His plans were not chaotic or the product of a disordered mind, but rather carefully crafted, detailed, and executed with surgical precision, masterfully exploiting the weaknesses, hidden desires, and deepest vulnerabilities of others. Delving deeper into the psychological analysis, we see that his actions can be understood through fundamental principles of social psychology, persuasion, and the dynamics of interpersonal manipulation. He was an unquestionable master at identifying hidden motivations, crafting convincing narratives that perfectly suited his listeners, and exploiting the cognitive dissonance of his targets, leading them to act against their own interests without even realizing they were being orchestrated. The logic behind his actions resided in a fundamental and painful belief that drove him. To be valued and recognized in a world that saw him as an other, he needed to be noticed at all costs, and often, negative attention, the fear, and the chaos he caused were preferable to the indifference and invisibility that haunted him since childhood. His acts of chaos, discord, and destruction were, paradoxically, desperate attempts to affirm his existence, his power, and his relevance in a universe that seemed to ignore or underestimate him. We can compare his behavior to the concept of recognition-seeking in psychology, where individuals with fragile self-esteem or a profound sense of inadequacy may resort to extreme behaviors, often harmful and self-destructive, to gain the attention and validation they desperately crave, creating a vicious cycle of power-seeking. Loki's constant use of illusions, disguises, mental tricks, and multiple personas can also be analyzed through the lens of self-presentation theory, a social psychology concept where individuals construct and maintain desired impressions for others, adapting to different contexts and situations. Loki constantly created and inhabited different personas, manipulating not only those around him, but also how he himself was perceived in order to achieve his goals. His sharp intellect, privileged mind, and acute observational skills allowed him to anticipate others' reactions with remarkable precision and adjust his plans accordingly, turning every interaction into a complex chessboard where he controlled the pieces. It wasn't randomness or madness. It was a cold and methodical calculation, a cunning and perverse application of the understanding of human nature to achieve his own ends, no matter the emotional cost or the consequences for others. The horror in his science was not destruction for destruction's sake, but the calculated manipulation that led to disorder. Loki's legacy is as complex and multifaceted as the God of Mischief himself, marked by an undeniable trail of disorder, discord, and unexpected consequences that spread throughout the cosmos, affecting countless lives. His actions, driven by his deep and painful quest for belonging and recognition, frequently resulted in widespread chaos, interdimensional conflict, and suffering for numerous beings, shaking the stability of Asgard and other realms, including Earth itself. However, and here lies the intricate complexity of his character, his legacy also includes moments of unexpected alliance, genuine sacrifice, and even reluctant heroism, revealing the depth, contradiction, and surprising capacity for evolution within his character, making him an unforgettable and fascinating figure. The most prominent way Loki shapes the world around him is through instability, the shattering of expectations, and disorder. He challenges the established order, not out of a desire for pure or senseless anarchy, but by exposing the fragilities, hypocrisies, and inherent flaws in power structures and those who wield them. His actions, often destructive in their impact, force others to confront their own beliefs, to question the nature of loyalty, justice, and what it truly means to be a hero or a villain in a morally ambiguous universe. Discussing the real and fictional consequences of his machinations, we see that chaos, though seemingly destructive at first glance, can also be a powerful catalyst for change, for the reevaluation of values, and for growth, both for individuals and for entire societies. Bringing a deep philosophical and moral reflection on Loki, we might ask, who are we to define what is good or evil? Especially when an individual's motivations are so deeply rooted in their pain, their life history, and their unmet psychological needs. Loki's motivations are, in essence, painfully human, rooted in the agony of rejection, an inferiority complex, and the relentless pursuit of acceptance and recognition that he never felt he fully received. His story reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, that the labels of villain or hero are often superficial simplifications of complex realities, and that actions, however questionable, can have complex and understandable origins, even if not justifiable. Concluding with a new mystery about the future of the God of Mischief and his continuing journey, we might wonder, but perhaps his search for belonging, for a home, and for acceptance is not yet over, and the line he walks between light and shadow continues to redefine itself, promising new chapters in his complex saga. Loki's legacy leaves us with a reflection on the fluid nature of identity, the complexity of human motivation, and the incessant pursuit of acceptance. His trickery and manipulations, though condemnable in their consequences, often mask profound pain, a desperate desire to find his place in the cosmos and to be seen and valued for who he truly is. His story is a vivid reminder that the lines between villain and hero are not always clear, and that the quest to prove one's worth can lead to dark and unexpected paths full of twists and turns. Ultimately, the lingering question is, will Loki find the acceptance and belonging he so deeply craves, or will he forever be trapped in a cycle of mischief, disorder, and self-affirmation through chaos, perpetuating his image as the God of Mischief? Prepare to delve into the mind of one of Marvel's most enigmatic and multifaceted characters, a being whose seemingly chaotic actions reveal complex tapestry of emotions and desires. Why does a being of such sagacity and power ceaselessly dedicate himself to intricate schemes and trickery, often at the cost of his own reputation and well-being? What if his actions, which at first glance appear to be driven by envy and unchecked ambition, actually mask a desperate search for a place to belong, a profound yearning for validation and acceptance that has shaped his entire existence? What you are about to discover might radically transform your understanding of identity, the hunger for validation, and the true meaning of being the God of Mischief, unveiling the psychological layers behind every illusion and every act of disorder. Before he was known throughout the galaxy as the cunning and unpredictable God of Mischief, Loki Laufeyson had an origin shrouded in mystery and marked by difference, a deeply guarded secret that would, unbeknownst to him, shape every facet of his existence. Found as an infant by the benevolent and imposing King Odin in Jotunheim, the icy and hostile realm of the Frost Giants, he was brought to Asgard and raised as a son, alongside the strong, acclaimed, and seemingly invincible Thor. This adoption, kept secret for many years for a reason that would be painfully revealed later, laid the groundwork for a profound and growing sense of displacement within Loki, growing up in a home that wasn't truly his, and being constantly and inevitably compared to his robust, popular, and admired brother Thor, who seemed to absorb all the attention and praise. Loki developed a sharp and painful perception of his own inadequacy and a persistent sense of always being in the other's shadow, never quite measuring up. Asgard's vibrant, warrior-centric environment, with its emphasis on brute strength, martial honor, glory in battle, and bravery, contrasted drastically with Loki's more subtle, cunning nature and innate magical talents, fostering a persistent feeling of not belonging and of being an eternal outsider in his own home. From an early age, Loki demonstrated a sharp intellect, an unusual sagacity, and a natural inclination for illusion, manipulation, and mischief. While Thor excelled in epic battles, grand feasts, and the pursuit of grand adventures that solidified his reputation, Loki found satisfaction in complex mind games, intricate riddles, and subverting the expectations of others, often playfully, but with a touch of malice. This striking disparity in their abilities and how they were perceived and valued by Asgardian society planted the seed of resentment and quiet, yet corrosive, envy. He desperately yearned for recognition, not through the brute strength he neither possessed nor valued, but through his superior intelligence, creativity, and cunning, qualities that were often overlooked or viewed with suspicion and even disdain in Asgard, which valued the fist more than the mind. The shocking revelation of his true lineage, that he was a frost giant by birth and not an Asgardian by blood, was a devastating blow to his already fragile and contested identity. intensifying the feeling of being a stranger in a world he considered his only home and for which he had shaped himself. The first psychological trait to clearly manifest and become a relentless driving force in his life was a deep and tearing inferiority complex, fueled by constant comparison to Thor and the painful concealment of his true origin. This feeling of not being good enough, of not being worthy of the unconditional love and acceptance he saw bestowed upon Thor, compelled him to seek validation in other ways, frequently through acts of manipulation, complex stratagems, and a relentless pursuit of power. He believed that by controlling situations, by subverting the established order, and by outsmarting others in cunning and intelligence, he could finally prove his worth, force the recognition he so craved, and perhaps silence the voice of inadequacy in his own mind. This search for external validation became a vicious cycle, where each attempt at self-affirmation through manipulation only pushed him further away from the genuine affection he secretly desired. But there was something no one saw coming, an incessant and desperate search for acceptance that would shape all his actions, transforming him from a complex youth into a being of distorted ambition and dubious intentions. The crucial and most painful moment in Loki's psychological formation was not a single, isolated event, but rather an overwhelming accumulation of experiences, revelations, and rejections that culminated in the irreparable fracturing of his already unstable and contested identity. The shocking and belated revelation of his true heritage as a frost giant was a devastating blow to his very being, exposing the fundamental lie that underpinned his existence in Asgard and shaking his own perceptions of who he truly was. This knowledge, which Odin and Frigga had kept secret his entire life to protect him, or, as Loki came to see it, to manipulate him, triggered a profound identity crisis, confronting him with the cold, cutting realization that he would never truly belong to the Asgardian family that had raised him, that he was a monster in disguise, an object of conquest, not a beloved son. This was the primary catalyst that intensified his feelings of alienation, resentment, and a growing desire for retribution against those he felt had deceived him. From this revelation, Loki began to transform irreversibly, not just in his actions, but in his very self-perception. His internal conflict was agonizing. On one hand, residual loyalty and affection for the Asgardian family who had taken him in and loved him. On the other, the deep and bitter feeling of betrayal for having concealed his origin and, in his perception, for having used him as a pawn in their power games. Externally, this emotional turmoil manifested in increasingly audacious acts of mischief, manipulation, and an inclination towards chaos, no longer as mere pranks, but as a desperate attempt to gain attention, to express his pain, and to prove that he, the monster in disguise, was capable of significantly impacting the world, of being seen and feared. Psychological science could explain this transformation through social identity theory and abandonment trauma, where the perception of not belonging to a dominant group or of being fundamentally different and rejected by it can lead to behaviors of self-exclusion, rebellion, and a search for acceptance through other means, even if those means are destructive or harmful to others. Loki, feeling fundamentally rejected and unloved in his own perception, sought to affirm his existence and worth through the disruption of order and chaos. Thor's jealousy, the prodigal son, the apparent heir, Odin and Asgard's undisputed favorite, also played a significant and constant role in Loki's grievance and progressive downfall. The constant admiration, praise, and unquestioning approval Thor received from Odin, Asgard, and his friends contrasted painfully with the distrust, caution, and lack of genuine appreciation with which Loki was treated, always seen as the troublesome brother or the trickster. This disparity fueled a profound sense of injustice and the belief that he needed to resort to trickery, intricate schemes, and his superior intellect to gain the recognition and love he felt were his due by right and had been denied to him. The need to prove his worth, not through the brute strength he lacked, but through his intelligence and cunning, became a consuming obsession, shaping his choices and pushing him towards the abyss. And it was there, in this whirlwind of conflicting emotions, shattered trust, and resentment that corroded his inner being, that everything began to unravel, paving the way for the ascent of the God of Mischief that the world would come to fear and, paradoxically, to understand. As Loki progressively distanced himself from the light and increasingly embraced the shadow of his own nature and his new self, his mind, once merely cunning, began to structure darkness in a methodical, calculating, and terrifyingly perceptive manner. His acts of trickery and manipulation, which initially might have been seen as mere pranks or demonstrations of intellectual superiority, ceased to be so, evolving into elaborate and complex schemes, woven with remarkable intelligence and a profound, almost predatory, understanding of other psychology. His words were like sharpened blades, capable of sowing discord, dividing allies, and exploiting the most intimate vulnerabilities of his adversaries, and even his supposed allies, turning them against each other. His attitudes, once oscillating and fraught with internal conflict, now revealed a new consolidated way of thinking, where others' trust was merely a weapon to be exploited and discarded, and truth, a malleable tool to be molded and distorted for his own ends and advantages. To understand Loki's mind during this crucial phase of his evolution, we must delve into his distorted, yet internally logical and consistently constructed perspective. He began to view the world through a lens of relentless competition and intrinsic distrust, where every interaction was a battle for control and recognition. Human relationships and power dynamics for him were not based on genuine loyalty and disinterested affection, but on power games on who could manipulate whom, and on strategic, temporary alliances, ready to be dissolved and used as targets when convenient. His superior intelligence, his privileged intellect, was his greatest weapon, and he wielded it with mastery to orchestrate complex events, to destabilize entire realms, and to pit people against each other, always with a grander objective in mind, to prove his supremacy and the fragility of others. We can draw an analogy with advanced game theory, where Loki saw himself not just as a player, but as the master player, always seeking the optimal strategy to achieve his goals, maximizing his gains, often at the cost of others' peace and well-being. His need for control, to always be one step ahead of everyone and to be the architect behind events, was a profound manifestation of his insecurity and his relentless pursuit of validation, a way to compensate for his sense of inadequacy. Loki's words and actions during this period revealed a growing and biting cynicism regarding human nature and a deeply ingrained belief that everyone, ultimately, was driven by selfish interests, hidden weaknesses, and easily exploitable vanities. He projected his own motivations and flaws onto others, justifying his crueler manipulations as a simple, inevitable exploitation of human nature and its predictable failings. The scientific analogy here can be found in the concept of Machiavellianism, a personality trait characterized by interpersonal manipulation, a lack of remorse or empathy, and a unilateral, relentless focus on one's own self-interest and benefit. Loki personified this characteristic in his essence, using his sharp intellect to deceive, mislead, and control those around him, turning every interaction into a stage for his own performance. But the true master of mischief was still honing his skills, and his plans would become even more complex, dangerous, and cosmic in scope, affecting not only Asgard, but the entire universe in his quest for a throne.